Okay. Well, seeing as John Dinan suggested the topic, I'm going to ask him to speak first and hope the rest of you are pondering on what you're going to say. So go ahead, John.
Thank you, Frank. I'm sorry I suggested these in the first instance at this stage.
You've only got 3 more of them to go, John.
Yeah, well, I'll act as sweeper the next time, maybe. Anyway, it's good to see you all after a few sessions that I missed. I was away. Good to see you all again. Yeah, I was just thinking about it over the last few days as well, and I think, you know, you can argue about fate, as Frank did a quick introduction to it, but you know, it could really be just simply a coincidence of 2 people coming together, or 2 issues coming together, or a bus at the wrong time and you step out in front of it, or something like that. So, you know, you could argue that it's just a coincidence, although you can easily see how it could become a sort of semi-religious type idea as well. But I'm not sure, was it the engineers who posted up something on the online thing on our phones? But I think the first fateful thing is that we were all actually conceived. I don't know, was it us that put up this guy, the speaker, who was talking about the incredible chance there is that a sperm, one particular sperm and one egg will actually meet, and all the other thousands or millions of sperm and that come just fail. So the fact that we've actually got here in the first place is probably extraordinarily more unlikely than winning the lotto, even the American one. Well, I just delete something off my window there. So I think that's the first fateful thing that probably we don't even think about much, but something recently prompted me to realize that, hey, yeah, we are pretty lucky to even be here, no matter how our lives are coming out. I know I've said a few of these things before, so I'm not going to spend too much time on them anyway, but or even on the whole thing here, because everyone needs to chat. But I've said before that when I was in, I think it was 4th class in primary school, and my colleague and Peter's very good friend Ray Crow passed around a drawing of Davy Crockett, and it was like a thunderbolt for me seeing a drawing like that and thinking, God, I'd love to be able to draw like that. And I remember spending the next 2 weeks trying to remember it and draw it. And I think that was quite faithful. I wonder if he didn't bring in that picture, I wonder, would there have been another similar thunderbolt moment? Or maybe if it happened in my teens as against when I was 10, maybe, or 8, would I have been more interested in girls at that time and said, back that art thing, you know? I'm not really sure. Whereas when I was in my teens, I used art to attract the girls by sketching them. So I don't know, that was the first fateful thing, I think. The second thing I thought of recently, which was a much more serious one, and which will probably ring a bell with a few people. It happened, I was watching a program the other night on TV, and it was reeling in the years which RTE present every single summer, going back to a particular year. And they show all sorts of videos of things. But in May 1974, I was working in the post office in Dublin as a young engineer. I didn't stay much longer there. I moved on. But in those days, the engineers, most people actually used to take early Friday afternoons. You know, you get your work done, you could go 3 or 4 or something like that. But on that afternoon, I headed off down North Earl Street. I was working in a place called Hammond Buildings in O'Connell Street, and you go down to the Pillar and turn left and go down North Earl Street, and then Talbot Street down to the train station where I was catching the train to Portmarnock. And I just missed the bomb by about 10 minutes when about, I don't know, 15 or 20 people were killed. And I'm quite certain that within that time frame that the car had been parked maybe an hour or 2 beforehand, because it was very hard to get parking. so it could have been there all day long. But I actually walked past the car that exploded, and I was on the train in Houston station, or not Houston, in Connolly station at the time. And before it even left the platform, we heard this enormous blast. And I just knew there was a bomb after going off, and we couldn't wait quick enough to get out of the station. And, you know, I wonder, was that fate? Because certainly that would have changed my life utterly. And a neighbor of mine who lived across the road, Ray Barr, Johnny Butler will know the Barrs because the mother was well known for organizing the Lindsay Singers, who became quite well known. And her son was seriously injured in that explosion. So that was a fateful thing in my view. So that was that. The other thing then, moving on quickly to what fate is, and I think that was what triggered it in the first place, where the color of my socks maybe changed my life. And I know I've told you that before, but I had separated and was living alone for a couple of years in, where was I? I was down near Bray at one stage in a gate lodge. And then I was living, no, before that I was living in a flat in Ballsbridge. But I was painting with the group that I paint with every summer in Roundstone. And this girl came down and said to me, are you John Dinan? And I said, yes. And I remember saying, who are you? And it was my current wife, Sheila, whom I hadn't seen for about 20 years, when we sort of dated very innocently in our holidays down in Rush in North County Dublin. But I hadn't seen her since she invited me to her Deb's dance when that was about 15, well, probably nearer 20 years previously, and I hadn't heard or seen her or knew of her. And she said, I recognized you from your white socks. You always wore white socks in your teens. And she was on holidays with a girlfriend. So to me, my whole life changed then, because, you know, it's quite desolate when you separate, and there was no real likelihood of getting back together. And so, you know, we kept in touch, and up to about a year later, we started to date. But that was very fateful, I think. That was fate, because my life has changed completely since then. Couple of pivot points. One, in 2001, I had been working in various jobs, which I'm not going to bore you with. I did once before, but I felt I had done enough of consultancy. I loved it, and I loved the problem solving, but I wanted to paint, and I was in my I was 54 at the time, and I knew I could go back to it, but I took a chance and went for 6 months full-time painting. And I told my clients at the time, I had a major new client, and I just wanted to test whether I could live alone and paint alone as against working with one or more people every single day. And that's now 22 years ago, and I haven't gone back. And I don't think it's likely that I'll be going back now. So that was a very big pivot point between consultancy and art. And lastly, then, you'll be glad to hear today, I'm sort of at another pivot point, because being 76, I had a few projects to do. And I must mention to Peter Ahern there that I'm not sure if he knows, but one of the things that we did during early year is we sold a house that we had in Glasnevin that we rented to friends for most of the last 20 years. And Peter, you'll be sorry to hear I bought a house very near you up in Hove. So we're literally, we have a sort of a, what would you call a pied de terre up about 300 meters from you, up off Tormanby Road, which we will use in our older years, I think. And certainly if anything happened to me, I think Sheila would be there, because all her family and friends live in the Hove area. But my pivot point, really, that was one of the projects I had to do this year. And so I stopped teaching this year completely. I did a couple of what they call plein air festivals, 1 day or 2 day things during the summer, where I was asked to do them. But the question now is, should I go back teaching and painting to keep myself alive and energetic and lively, or should I play a bit more golf? I've played about 3 times this year, having paid €600 to join? Or should I sort of, inverted commas, retire and just keep painting? So I haven't solved that one yet. So that's my current, I'm in the middle of a pivot point. Okay, thanks.
Well, that's
John,
great.
just following up on what you say about walking down Talbot Street. Another chap who walked down Talbot Street at the same time as you was Dermot Desmond.
Yeah?
You know Dermot Desmond? And he
Yeah.
walked down same way, got onto the train, maybe the same train as you. And you know, if anything had happened to him, he's the guy, the brains behind the IFSC. So we may
Okay.
not have had an IFSC only for that in that particular sense. And I remember him saying that as he walked down, he realised that he'd forgotten to buy a bottle of milk or whatever it was for his wife. So I'm not going all the way back to get her, and kept on going and just missed the van.
Wow. Wow. And I remember going in because it was a Friday. I always bought something for the kids. And I actually took about 10 minutes in the street behind Gardner Street. I'm not sure what that's called, just before you go under the bridge, but it would still be quite close to where the bomb went off. I went in there for about 10 minutes to buy a few bits and pieces for the kids on a Friday afternoon. But yeah, that's interesting about Dermot Desmond.
Yeah.
Frank, over to you.
Okay, who would like to go next?
Peter, you're on mute.
I was yelling at my wife, sorry. You waiting for me?
Are we getting a volunteer to speak?
Here I go. Yeah.
Go.
Yeah, John, I have to get your address. Close for a pint.
Yeah,
some point.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I've had, you know, I think in my presentation ages ago, I talked about several pivot points that I had, but just a general reflection that I've often wondered about is that, did I just meander along waiting to see what door would appear in front of me, or did I chart my own course? And I think I did more of the former. Maybe most people do. And maybe I did, yeah, the vast majority of the former. They had in Cleveland here, they had a thing last weekend, Forbes magazine, they call it 30 under 30. So these are the 30 most successful people in the US under 30 years of age. Many of them, maybe most of them, billionaires. And that's kind of an extraordinary thing, that someone could become a billionaire in their 20s. I mean, I know it's happened in Ireland with the Collison brothers and so on. But I just feel that some of those were very single-minded in pursuing something specific, rather than waiting to see, you know, go for a couple of interviews, who'd offer them a job, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know whether I regret that or not, but I don't know whether I've ended up any differently, but that's just a general reflection. A couple of pivot points stand out for me. One is that just the year I was doing my master's in Trinity, over the Christmas holidays, a friend of mine was working with a company in Cabra West, a refrigerated warehousing company, and he said, we're behind in the accounts department. Do you want to come in and help kind of clear some of the backlog of invoices? So I went in, I sat down at one of these adding machines with the tally roll, and I worked at that. And in the course of that, I met the managing director, David McCabe. And, you know, he asked, what was I doing in Trinity and so on. I told him I was doing computer science. And then that's the next summer after I graduated, I was looking for jobs in England. The previous year, I'd done sort of engineering interviews. These ones are more computer oriented. But David phoned me over the summer and said, you know, we've got a computer in our company. We spent a hell of a lot of money on it. It's not working. Would you be interested? So I jumped on that. That was going in, I knew it was a short-term assignment. So that kind of led me down a whole unexpected path. When that ended after a year and a half, David had sold out his interest in the company, and he was quite wealthy, a guy in his mid-30s, and he wanted to start a business in the UK, and he asked me if I'd come and work with him on that. So I did, and it was in publishing. So I'd gone already way off the track. So that was a kind of a curious pivot point that I put down to my best friend, my best man, eventually, happening to say, would you like this job over Christmas? But it's an example of how I kind of just followed, you know, a path, and whatever popped up in front of me was what I did next, rather than saying, I want to go here and do that. I think the second one was in the 90s, when I was working for a Northern Ireland-based economic development outfit that suddenly folded. It lost its funding. I was told in November, sorry, we have no more money to pay you. You're not fired, you're not terminated, but you're not going to get paid. So I was in a kind of it continued on a little bit beyond that. But what I did at that point was I started phoning everybody I knew. And that was maybe one instance in which I somewhat took charge. And one of the guys that I phoned, Bill German, a friend of mine in Toronto, said he had a project from the Northern Ireland Training and Employment Agency, and to bring their trainees over to Canada, and he couldn't get visas for them, but they could probably get visas to the US, and would I manage that program? So I did, and I became a functioning member of the middle class unemployed consultants. So they were two big pivot points for me. That freelance consulting led me to link up with a friend who was starting this global health company that eventually ended up being my career from 2000 onwards. So I identified those two particular ones, that the termination of that job in 1994, and then back in 1970, my friend getting me a job in AutoZero. And finally, an interesting thing that I came across in the IDA when we were trying to get entrepreneurs, I met with Professor Jerry Rickson in UCC, who was the engineering professor and kind of famous at the time because he'd done something with NASA. And I was asking him, how would he get entrepreneurs out of the engineering school in UCC? And he said, the engineers, the guys coming out of this class, all they're thinking about is getting out of here and getting married to their girlfriend and getting a steady job. You're not going to get any entrepreneurs out of this place. And I thought that was interesting. I don't know, is that to do with the way you're formed through an academic, or tend to be formed through an academic education, or what? That's it for me. Go on mute, Frank.
Okay, I'll give a completely different perspective. So fate seems to imply whatever happens is going to happen, whereas I think of it in a different way. I think, hey, I can play with the mala, that's the Irish building block stuff, to create my own fate. And in my early 20s, one or two incidents caused me to get very proactive about that. So I started, and I didn't do it formally, but I started doing it de facto, and that was to rewire my brain. And partially that was taking responsibility for a tough 10 to 20 spell in my life where my dad became a practicing alcoholic again. and that brings a lot of baggage to the kids, and there were 6 kids in our family. So I became the dad when I was 10, the functioning dad when I was 10. So mid-20s, I say, hey, you can be a victim or you can start taking responsibility. So that's when my rewiring started. And one thing I immediately realized, I think to find myself, I had done a huge amount of hitchhiking in other countries. And I was always looking forward to the new street, entering the new village as it was getting dark, to see who I was going to encounter and to see what the heck was going to happen. And I actually started to wire my brain that, hey, I'm going to have a good experience when I go into this village. And invariably it happened. And I think it's built into the human condition when, even if you're in animosity with different regions, different tribal regions, if a stranger comes in, they get treated with respect and with a certain degree of hospitality, depending on the location in the world. And that certainly had a huge effect on my attitude to life. Then I got into more formal social psychology and just personal psychology, the way the brain worked and the way people interacted and why. And that was a huge exploration that I'm still in the middle of. And I think that causes an ongoing wiring of my brain as well. Even now, I feel changes occurring in me when I get into new situations and allow it to happen. And I say to myself quite often, hey, I hope I encounter somebody who has a completely different wiring structure to me that causes them to think and behave in a different way. Because if I'm just with kindred spirits doing more of the same, I'm never going to grow or encounter that new village that I can go into to meet the strangers. So all of you guys, for example, when I connected, especially by Zoom, I really appreciate those of you who are very, very different to me, because that's where the tire hits the road. I'm not validating the wiring that I see in myself. I'm validating human wiring that's out there that can make us all so awesome and so different.
Good. Well, thank you, Peter. Anybody else want to step up? I'm looking at you.
The opening sentence in the Basil's book for my particular history went something along the lines of referring to a career unendowed with wisdom, vision, or planning. And effectively, that's how it's been right up to this day. But I suppose reflecting on what might have been pivot points or points where fate took a hand, I suppose the first would be shortly after you and I, Johnny B, got back from either Spain or Scotland, when back in 62 or 63, when I met my present wife, who was with me here now in Mayo. That was a pretty major pivot point.
No, Scotland.
It was Scotland, was it? 62, yeah. And then I suppose the choice of engineering as a career was in my case couldn't have been better. Couldn't have picked a better subject. But I don't assign that to fate. Just the natural course of events, the natural course of one's personal interests. And thereafter, most of the pivot points have really been geographic. Having to react to a new location and find a way of making a living and a place to live in a new location. And thus far, I've been lucky. but when it comes to fate, I'm afraid I'd be a bit skeptical. One particular thing I have to say, I feel I've been incredibly fortunate. There's very little I look back on that I would have regrets about, or I would have I would wish things had turned out differently. So on that note, I'll leave it at that. I'm a lucky guy, and here I am, 76 years of age. I don't have most of my body. I don't have some of my body parts left, but those that I have are still functioning. So, and please God, they'll continue to.
Well, I can give you two thoughts. First of all, a note to Peter. Peter, when I hear everything you're doing today, and I remember, the things we did when we went to UCD, and all the times you went to the snooker hall, my whole view of you has changed. Then, the biggest interest was figuring out how you could, give me 10 points and then beat the hell out of me at snooker for the price of a pint. You remember those days?
I'm trying to forget them.
I have two small points. When I was about 5, my father had bought this car, and he changed the engine, redid the engine in it, and he had some neighbors over one night to put the car back in, the engine back in. And one neighbor gave me a watch, a little pocket watch. So I proceeded to take an axe and break it open. And my mother said, "What are you doing? I want to see what's inside." And she said, "Oh, Jim's going to be an engineer." And that's how I became an engineer. So that was a significant event, very small, but I maintained that until I finished engineering. The other thing is that I got reorganized out of my job. We had a new manager coming in, and I got reorganized out of my job probably about 5 or 6 years before I actually retired. And I went back to my skills, my skill set, my technical skills. And actually, I was able to hone and polish my skills. So when I retired, I went back to work part-time. And that was 16 years ago. And I'm still doing the part-time work. So what looked like, it was sort of an event, sort of a traumatic event at the time. It turned out to be fortuitous, because had I stayed in the job and retired, I would have no skill set to work, useful skill set to work after retired. So what looked like it was bad at the beginning actually turned out to be quite good. And those two are things, just two things I remember.
I have to say, I can associate with that idea of the skill set that follows you out of retirement, or out of beyond the normal working lifespan.
Yes.
Into retirement. Another aspect in which I've been fortunate, a skill set that's marginally saleable.
It is. Well, the problem, the benefit I have is I work in power plants, and the average life of a power plant is longer than our average working life. So if your skill set was to work in televisions that were sold in 1965, they're all in the junk pile.
Yeah.
But they're still running those old power plants, and they need people to work on the controls. And the young guys, when they take up the diagram and look at it, say, "Oh my God, what is this stuff?" So it's just sort of a niche business.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at
are those power plants typically nuclear, or electric, or other fossil fuel, or both?
Both. I've worked on a lot of work on nukes, some on fossil, and then some on the combined cycle units, because the new engineers never figured out why we did something the way we did it 40 years ago, and they change it, and then it doesn't work. So you get to revisit the new equipment. It's varied, but it's interesting.
Following on Paddy and indeed Jim there, why did I do engineering? And I suppose looking back at the 7 of us who went to college, I think I was not like Jim, who broke open his watch, or Peter, who was always with his motorbikes. I came in because of our maths teacher, Mr. Buckley, and our applied maths teacher. So that was where I came from, rather than the technical aspects. I suppose other than that, a bit like Paddy, one pivot point for me was meeting my my wife, and I have to thank Eamon Coffey for that. Thank you, Eamon. The reason was that I was actually working in Dundalk at GE, and Eamon was having a party one Friday night, so I came down and I went to the party and I met her good self. She came from Laytown, where we used to go on holiday, so that became a kind of a talking point, and it went on from there. It's 51 years since. I suppose another point I often think of is it's a bit like the one that John was saying there. I spent 1 year abroad, different to you people. I went to Bahrain, the Middle East. But how that came about was I was leaving Foss on Friday afternoon. I was going out to the shops, and we had two double doors, and I pushed it to go out through the first one. And as I went through it, this woman was walking by who I knew inside. I said, hello, I walked, and then she followed me. I said, by the way, he said, we have a job out in Bahrain. Would you be interested? And I said, where is Bahrain? What is Bahrain? So basically that's how it came about. I often think if I hadn't gone out to buy a paper or whatever it was, that may not have happened. Which might have been a good thing, but not the way. But other than that, I've led a very boring life.
Well, I kind of realized early in life that I wasn't the most gifted person, and it showed up in engineering. When I was finishing engineering, there were no clamors from engineering companies to hire me, and I kind of knew that. But serendipity stepped in the form of Mick Barrett. Mick, you guys may know, Mick had a job with Westinghouse the previous summer, an internship, and had a guaranteed job with them. All he had to do was pass the physical of having the chest X-ray, because they weren't accepting people who had TB into the US in the 60s. And Mick failed. He had a spot on his lung. And Westinghouse asked him, did he know anybody else who might be interested? And Mick and I were best friends, most of you know. And he said, yeah, I know this guy Walsh. And that was it. I got a job offer very quickly after that. Would Westinghouse have ever approached me? Would GE have ever approached me? Not in a million years. I just wasn't good enough. So serendipity stepped in there. And the second serendipitous event occurred very quickly after that. When I went to the US, I was only in Westinghouse less than 6 weeks when I came out to the Bloomington plant. And I was out there just on a whim. I was only going to stay for a month because I knew somebody that worked here. And he said, just come out here. The weather's great. You can do that, 4-week gig that we're all allowed to do, and you can go back to Pittsburgh or wherever you want to go. I was approached by one of the engineering managers. As soon as I got to Bloomington, they were looking for an assignment for me. He says, by any chance, can you program? Now, this is 1968. I don't know about you guys, but there weren't a lot of fucking programmers around in the engineering world in 1968 in engineering. It was a very, very new skill. I had taken our class in Fortran in UCD, the one class we all took. The one thing I think I do have is a really good sense of when an opportunity is being offered. And in the split second after he said, can you program? I realized, I think my future is being determined here. I had a vague idea what computers were all about, but I knew it wasn't something that was going to go away. And I said, yes, sir, I can. I had no freaking idea what they were proposing. They presented me with essentially what is now a cloud computer. Peter, was located in Cleveland. It was an IBM mainframe on a dial-up line, a teletype line. And they told me the language was BASIC. I'd never heard of BASIC, but I said, geez, I learned Fortran. How hard can this be? Because the Fortran is a technical language. BASIC is pretty primitive compared to Fortran. It took me a day and a half to learn it, and it changed my life. My career as an engineer was essentially over at that stage. I spent 3 more years working in the engineering department doing programming for engineers. that was the extent of my actual engineering. I was writing testing programs and other kind of logic things for the engineers, none of whom could program. Now, within 2 or 3 years, every engineer coming out of college in the US, and I suspect in Ireland, was well aware and knew how to program. But serendipity offered me that opportunity, and it completely changed my career. I spent the rest of my career in IT.
Wow.
So, I mean, serendipity, saved me on more than one occasion.
Well, I'll intervene here. I had a couple of pivot points that I was not expecting, and that in the end turned out well, although one was a tragedy. The first one, not the tragedy, was I enrolled in commerce at UCD, and I was at it for about 2 weeks. And my father was very close to our parish priest, and he brought him over to the house one night. And the parish priest, engineering was my second choice, and the priest came over to the house. His name was Father Kenny, and he said to me, "You're crazy. You have a university scholarship and you're doing commerce. You should be doing something more ambitious." And I switched to engineering immediately and have never regretted it. The second thing that happened to me was in my career, I was doing well. First of all, I was a technical expert, then I was a general manager, and I really wanted to get deeper into international sales. But there was a guy doing international sales for our company, a friend of mine, an Irish-American guy called John Keyes, and I liked him a lot, and we got on very well. But he came back from a visit to China, and he was independently wealthy, even though he was, working in a reasonably modest job. But he had his own plane, and he crashed his plane about 700 yards, ran out of fuel short of an airport in South Carolina, and was killed instantly. And we were in the middle of our first major negotiation in China, and I was just plucked out of it. And literally a week later, I was on a plane to China to take over from him. Unfortunately, I mentioned before, there was a sad part of the story, apart from him dying, was that he hadn't told us, but he was, after his last trip from China, he was banned because he was caught with cocaine in his luggage. So that changed my career considerably, and I spent the last 20 years of my life working a fair bit internationally, and I really enjoyed that. So those were two kind of pivot points in my life that came upon me quickly and had to be acted on within a week or so.
Yeah, Frank, a tragedy interposed on my life too. And I was working in in Thermo King, which is a division of Westinghouse in Galway. Helen, my wife, had not been particularly happy and really hadn't wanted to go back to Galway. She was always talking about going back to Bloomington. I happened to mention to my best friend from Bloomington here, Alan Berg, that, I wasn't that happy in the job, and Helen wanted to go back, and blah, 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 blah. And then I get a phone call from Alan saying that the general manager wanted to talk to me, and the reason he wanted to talk was my former boss had shot himself the day before that.
Wow. His
wife had been having an affair or something, and he went out in the woods and shot himself. And the GM said, Alan tells me that you're interested in coming back. His job is yours if you'd like it. So, another tragedy stepped in.
Mm-hmm. And you have to react very quickly in those circumstances. All your great plans for going in one direction suddenly change and you go a different way.
The half-life of that offer was ours.
Yeah.
He was basically asking me, if you want the job, it's yours, but if you can't, we need to fill the job immediately. This is an emergency. situation. It wasn't a job that could go without being filled quickly.
I had to take over a negotiation in China with the Ministry of Railways, and I had to go to the Chinese consulate and all this and get an instant visa and read up on everything. And I was over there in a week because they weren't going to wait.
Yeah.
You know, and so, yeah, it was a quick change in my life and one that turned out well.
Just a small input when others are mobilizing to talk. And as Frank says, I'm looking at you. I believe that the ability to deal decisively with those forks in the road and the crossroads, and even creating some of them, comes from it comes from the culture in large measure that you grow up in. And for example, in the States, up to the 60s, that attitude was very culturally present. You look at a movie of a guy walking down the street in Moscow, you can immediately tell the American. He owns the town. And America, to a large measure, brought up kids to think that way, very confident, slight swagger, and many of them thought they were better, and I'm talking on measurement scales here, than they actually were professionally, but they had that entrepreneurial configuration inside their head, and that's why so many of them became so successful. Whereas in developing countries, and a little bit in Ireland when we were growing up, that it was memorizing stuff in school, and I think we got our independence, perhaps the guys sitting here, from our parents saying, hey, it's 8 o'clock, go out, and I don't want to see you until it's dark this evening. So we created our own independence in that way. But a lot of current cultures are actually realizing what I'm talking about, and they're bringing in a different attitude to education, not to learn by rote, but to allow people to actualize themselves.
That's a very good point. You know, I was thinking similarly along those lines in relation to Barry. You said, Barry, with that last situation you had, a mere hour, you had to make, you know, an instant decision. Similarly, when you're asked, can you program, you could have maybe answered in the way that, you know, I kind of experienced the environment in Ireland as a kid, that you don't brag. You might say, well, sure, I know a bit, or, you know, I might be able to, I wouldn't be sure, whatever. You said, yes, sir. That was a good, gutsy move.
Peter was out of desperation. I mean, as I said, I wasn't looking at a promising career. And when that opportunity presented itself, something told me this is a chance to be a one-eyed man in a blind man's country.
Yeah.
So in my case, guys, my pivot point was kind of interesting. So when I graduated, I had 6 job offers. 5 of them were in England and 1 of them was in Ireland. And I got all kinds of pressure from my parents and everybody else to take the job in Ireland. So I wind up at the ESB. And I'm there a year, and I get this chance to go work with Siemens. And so for 6 months, everything was great. I was in Raglan Road. Everything was good people to work with, was fun experience. And then out of the blue, I get transferred to Abbey Street in the middle of Dublin. And I'm working low tension distribution with this guy who was an electrician, essentially. And he was down in the basement. I was on the first floor, and we're trying to sell this stuff. And I was going up and down the stairs all the time. And something I'd done when I was graduating, like everybody else, there were all these companies coming and interviewing people. So I'm doing the rounds like everybody else. And one of them, the General Electric company. And I believe the guy that I got, it wasn't the TMP guy, it was a manufacturing guy. And he was pushing manufacturing really hard. And I'm thinking, do I really want to be in manufacturing? I'm not so sure of that. But one thing he was pushing really hard is he said, you know, it's going to take you a while to get a visa. Now, if you're smart, you'll go to the American embassy and sign up right now. And I kind of just didn't think too much about it, but I got on a bus, I go out to Ballsbridge, and I sign up for a visa. And then I completely forgot about the whole thing. And wouldn't you know, here I am down in Abbey Street, the end of 1969, minding my own business, trying to figure out how we're going to sell this stuff, when out of the blue, I get this blue envelope in the mail, and it's an inquiry from the General Electric company. And they said, we're looking for electrical engineers in Schenectady, New York. Are you interested in interviewing? And you bet I was interested in interviewing. So I fly over to Birmingham or Manchester, one or the other, and I spend the day with this guy, pretty nice, friendly guy, and everything went well. And the next week I had a job offer, and I mean, that was it. And it was, when you think about it, I mean, a lot of people wouldn't pay attention. They'd say, I'll do it next week, I'll do it 2 weeks from now, and not do anything about it. But, you know, fortunately, the way I grew up, hey, do this, do that, do the other thing. I said, okay, I'll do it. So otherwise, I'm sure I'd be in Ireland. And whether I'd be happy or not, I don't know. But I've never had a second thought about that decision. Absolutely. I've really enjoyed living here in the United States. It's been a lot of fun. I'd had an alternative experience in Ireland. Whether it would have been as good as this, I don't know. But certainly I've got no regrets whatsoever.
Well, I since you mentioned Schenectady, I also arrived in Schenectady in 1969. I spent 2 nights looking for downtown Schenectady, not realizing I was in it. And I said, oh shit, what am I doing here?
Yeah, actually, I arrived March 1970, and it was just after the strike was over, the big G strike and stuff like that. So, and yeah, there were a lot of car dealerships, and there was, you know, that one bar downtown, Niklaus's, that everybody went to on a Friday afternoon. And so we would do that every so often. And this one Friday I come back and I realized there's all of this mail on the table in the middle of the living room, and I'm got this apartment with Eugene Cooney, and I'm going through the mail, and one of them got my name on it, and there's this bland address up in the top left-hand corner, and I open it up and I started reading. It says, "Greetings from the president." And I think, well, that's a surprise. I didn't know he knew me. So I start to read, and it's a notice to go for a medical exam at 123 Wall Street, Schenectady, New York, prior to induction into the armed forces of the United States of America. So you all know the routines. So I go to my boss, Nick Schmidt, and I said, Nick, how about this? And he read it and he says, can I borrow that? And I said, sure, but bring it back. So a couple of days later, he comes back and he's got the letter, he gives it back to me, and he's got another letter from GE to the draft board saying that, hey, this guy works here in Schenectady, New York. He's an large steam turbine generator. We have a sister division in Westland, Massachusetts, and his work, they build gas turbines, I think it was, for the Navy, and they drive like destroyers and cruisers. And his work in Schenectady is absolutely indispensable to the war effort. Now, I love that phrase, and I'm thinking, oh, I'm free. Well, I wasn't, because they read it and they said, maybe, and we'll think about it. So, however, we'll give you a 90-day stay of induction, before we do anything more. And in the meantime, because all of these senators' sons and representatives' sons in Washington were getting easy deferments. There was a huge racket about this, and they changed the system of selecting people, and they went to a lottery system, like all of you are probably familiar with. So there we all are in this apartment in Schenectady, watching, you know, the drums being rolled and the Boy Scout and the Girl Scout, and they pull out a number and they stand in the middle with this over their heads. And there's a bunch of us, and Brendan Sheehan was one of them. And Brendan, super bright guy, he had either at first place or second place in chemical engineering at UCD. I think he had first place. And so they start pulling out numbers, and the first one is number 1, of course, and they mention the date, and I hear this loud fuck behind me, and it's Brendan Sheehan, because he's got first place in chemical engineering and first place in the draft too. So he left and went back to Dublin a week later and got into consultancy and did extremely well. But I'm sitting there with everybody else. I'm thinking, how long is this going to go on? So they go through all 300. Well, they go to, all 365 numbers. And when they got to mine, middle of August 13th, 307. So I said, that's pretty good. And they stopped drafting at 196. And Eugene Cooney's number was 193. So there was that whole thing that happened with Eugene. And so there's two pivot points in my life that, you know, things would have been totally different. Just, you know, maybe by happenstance, who knows? But, you know, I grew up with all of these people telling me, oh, it's God's will. You know, he got in his car and he drove too fast and he got in an accident. It's God's will. No, it happened because he got in and he drove too fast. You know, that kind of thing. I heard it all my life. So anyway,
Westinghouse Electric may have been doing it a little differently. When we were given the job offer at Westinghouse, we were all told, you will have a 2A deferment. We will arrange it for you. And I didn't have to do anything. I mean, we had to go through a sign-up process, obviously, with the selected service, but I got a 2A deferment, you know, within weeks, and it was all done by Westinghouse.
Well, I'm in Schenectady 5 months and like 10 days or something like that, and this letter shows up. And I'm wondering, how in the hell could these people have found me? I only just got here. I just have my job. I just got my social security number. And then I think, oh, that's how they found me, the social security number. So, you know, that was a big decision point for a lot of people. And I'm thinking I got two choices here before the lottery came along. One was the lottery. One was to go to Canada, and the other was to go back home to Ireland.
Did
you know of any UCD? Do you know of any UCD engineers that went to Vietnam?
And that was my question too.
Yeah,
I know.
Remember Tom Kelly in our year? I seem to recall he had the rather novel approach when being interviewed by potential US employers. When he was asked about if he was drafted, what would his response be? And his response apparently was, I'd go. And as a consequence, he had a choice of jobs to go to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think basically what was happening at that stage, Paddy, was that all of you being interviewed were all saying, what would happen if I'm drafted? And Tom, at the end of the interview, and they asked Tom, I mean, any question? He said, yeah, will you keep my job for me when I come back from Vietnam? And first, I think he got the first offer.
Yeah, a
lot of people had higher grades than Tom, but you know, he impressed.
But Eamon, your situation doesn't make sense to me, because I came over first on a green card in 1965, and then I got a deferment while I was in school. And then under my guidance, I didn't have to register the draft until a year. I had to register when I came back, but right away, because I was an alien. But you shouldn't have had to register after 5 months.
Well,
thought
no,
it was
I
a
got the
year.
notice after 5 months. The notice saying you're eligible, for the medical exam.
Oh, okay.
They figured out I was 1A, which was true. That was accurate. I mean, didn't have any limps or anything like that. So yeah, I was prime cannon fodder. But the weird thing about it was that, I have this documented important job, and it's helping the war effort, no matter how you look at it. And these guys were absolutely determined to make me into cannon fodder, which was, it made no sense whatsoever. So the
Well,
right hand wasn't,
You must have been a better guy than me because
Guys,
I didn't get my
can
deferment.
I flip? We're in a closed loop on recruitment to the US Army. We're all 76, 77, and there's a mantra out there that when you see death in front of you, that you start reverting to hey God, let's be pals again. So have any of you guys noticed a change in yourselves towards spirituality in your advancing years?
not in my case.
Not in my
If
case.
anything, I've gone the other direction.
Yeah.
Not in my
I
case.
mean, yeah, I mean, you started when you were in college, you do all this math and you do all the mechanical drawing and everything else, and everything fits, everything works, everything has, an answer, more or less. So, I mean, you really start to wonder about, well, in the Catholic religion, you got one thing here and you got another thing here, and they don't agree. And suddenly there's a miracle in the middle, and that solves all of the problems. So, I mean, I mean, I'm not as, a gung-ho Catholic as I used to be, but, I still go to Mass Sundays, and, but I'm very skeptical. Let's put it that way.
Is this not one of John's other four topics?
Yeah, I think so.
For a later session. But I just reflecting on pivot points and all this chat about being drafted in the United States, I suspect that might have been a hidden pivot point for me, because none of the American employers, in spite of my best efforts, saw fit to offer me a job in the United States. So I suspect I avoided that particular hurdle. And frankly, I wonder if I had been offered a job in the States, I would probably have taken it. So the whole thing.
I have to run here, but I want to say something about Eamon's situation and the rest of us. I think, Eamon, GE, the response when you gave them that letter is essentially the response that Westinghouse had. Basically, the guy I talked to in Westinghouse about this a year or two later, he said there was no way we were going to recruit people like you and let them be taken by the Defense Department. No way.
Well, yeah, and the people at Large Steam Turbine Generator, they made it absolutely abundantly clear, hey, we spent 2 years getting you. You're not leaving here if we have possibly got nothing to do with it. But
well, Eamon, you must be better than me, because I did not get my deferment. And I went through the first lottery, but like you, my number was 328. But I did not get a deferment.
Yeah, but I didn't get a deferment either, Jim. I just looked out. The timing was right. I mean, I get the letter like whenever it was, the middle of August or something like that. And in the 90 days moving forward, that's when the lottery showed up. I just looked out.
I've got no sympathy for any of you guys. I never even got a job offer. So on that note, I'm going to bid you adieu.
Hey, one quick last one. Is there mega bad weather in Ireland at the moment?
If you're in Cork, there is.
Yeah.
Also, it's isolated. It's down in the Cork area. Okay.
Yeah, but it's raining a lot here. It rained a lot last night here, but nothing like Cork. Middleton and Cork is completely flooded. Waterford, and it's coming again tonight. It's also heading for the UK.
We drove across the country today from Navan to Mayo, and it rained the entire way.
Yeah, my family lives in Cork, Peter, and they said they got a year's worth of rain in 24 hours.
Wow.
And a few other towns.
Good night, guys.
Guys, we'll finish it up here. I'm
Yeah, I gotta go.
We'll see you again, Patty.